Let's now welcome climatologist Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi. Professor, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So firstly, please simplify this bill and what it seeks to do. We understand in broader context that it is expected, of course, to catalyze South Africa's transition towards a greener and more resilient economy. But in layman terms, please elaborate. What does this mean?
So thank you very much. So in layman terms, the bill is basically an expression of intention from the government, firstly recognizing the importance of addressing climate change, secondly recognizing that climate change affects all levels of society and all sectors of the economy, and also recognizing that South Africa as a country needs to respond in an integrated and systematic way. So the bill sets out the various ways and mechanisms in which the government wants to respond to climate change. First, in the instance of mitigating, which is the reduction of carbon emissions. And second, and importantly for South Africa, in the area of adaptation, which is dealing with the impacts of climate change that we are already facing, that people are already dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
But Doctor, I hear you. Does South Africa really need this bill, and why? And how do we then fare as compared to the global efforts in order to reduce the greenhouse gas or GHG emissions in this regard?
So I think the bill is important because, we teach our students that what is not written is what is not done. So having a climate change act that actually stipulates what is needed, it institutionalizes climate change response in South Africa and obligates departments to come up with strategies. There's a timeline that is set out in the Climate Change Act in terms of compliance and the various implementation plans that need to be put in place. Globally, it puts South Africa in a small group of progressive countries that have actually got legislation that speaks to climate change response. And importantly for South Africa, South Africa is the biggest emitter in Africa in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because it's the most advanced industrialized country as well. So it's very important for South Africa to set an example in that regard. And also, I think the important thing is the systematic nature that the bill introduces in terms of how to respond to climate change.
Doctor, how do we then adapt the economy to the impacts as well of global climate change? How do we go about with this transition? And also, I'm sure a lot of people want to know what will be the direct impact as well as repercussions, particularly in the job sector, if, for example, we have to do away with certain industries or sectors. This is quite a concern, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the importance of the emphasis on the just transition. And I know the just transition has mostly been talked about in the context of energy, the fossil fuels, but the just transition affects all sectors of the economy, which need to transform and transition to become climate resilient. And what is important is when we talk about the just transition, is the inclusion, the equity aspects, which means there should be no losers in essence. So even as we transition from coal to renewables, the emphasis should be on how do we reskill people, how do we repurpose some of these old plants so that jobs are not lost, economies of small towns are not damaged, and leave no person behind, but actually creating new and more diverse and sustainable employment opportunities that fit into the future.
And Doctor, with this bill being passed, has the sector, of course, looked at some of the potential risks, as we've just mentioned, the security in terms of job security? Have these been communicated so that it can also allow for ease of implementation of the bill? Yeah,
so job creation and job security has been quite topical, especially given the high rates of unemployment in South Africa. Social transformation and addressing equity and poverty has also been very important given the high levels of inequality in South Africa, accompanied by the high levels of poverty. So the bill actually sets out these things. And even in its preamble, it does not just talk about addressing the economy, but it also talks about society, implying that people are equally as important in this transition to a low carbon and climate resilient South Africa. So I think a lot of focus has been on people, and a lot of focus has been on nature. How do we preserve the environment? But ultimately, it's how do we ensure that society continues and also develops. We still need to develop, but under the context of climate change.
Very interesting indeed, Doctor. Now, in closing, I want us to talk about the positives as well, especially, I'm sure you heard in the insert preceding our interview about the agricultural sector, which seeks to benefit the most, particularly from this bill being passed.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of positives if the bill is implemented in the right way, if we get to invest in our hydrometeorological, if we get to invest in our early warning systems, if we get to ensure that information and early warnings get to farmers, especially that they are able to respond and adapt to climate change, if we are also able to invest in the infrastructure that mitigates the risk of some of these hazards, to protect infrastructure and ensure that farmers, especially in rural areas, who are just doing agriculture for subsistence and selling a bit of surplus, are able to be protected and can even thrive. I think part of it is changing the narrative a little bit, because the narrative has always been about dark and gloominess when we talk about climate change, but it's also saying that this is a reality, but we could still thrive as a society despite this reality.
And there's no time frame on this, Doctor, in terms of by the year 2030, South Africa needs to have eradicated certain firms that are obviously the biggest emitters in terms of greenhouse emissions.
So there have been commitments that are outlined in the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, in terms of South Africa's plan to phase out. I don't think we can get rid of fossil fuels overnight. They need to be phased out. And this is also part of that just transition. They need to be phased out progressively, whilst renewables are also phased in progressively. There are timelines in the bill in terms of how long we need to develop the national adaptation goals, how long we need to develop the actual implementation plan, the guidelines on how to implement it, how long we need to develop the scenarios that will inform the actions to be taken. So there are very clear timelines in the bill, and I'm quite encouraged because the department, the DFFE, has already started to roll out some of these actions. So there's been a lot of proactive response from government in terms of its implementation, and so far it's quite encouraging.